Believe it or not, Karen from the HOA tried to kick me out of my own house because I was having a party. She came with rules, threats, and even tried to call the police. There's just one little detail she didn't know. I own the whole neighborhood, and even the house she lives in. I think everyone has met someone who thinks they run the world. You know, that kind of person who behaves as if they've been elected supreme empress of the neighborhood? Well, that's right. This story is about one of those people. I've always been discreet. I work hard, I like my peace, and, in general, I don't interfere in anyone's life. But one day, I decided to have a party. Nothing out of the ordinary, just a barbecue in the backyard, a few drinks, and some music to liven things up. After all, after living in that neighborhood for so long, I thought it was only fair to celebrate a little. What I didn't know was that there was a supernatural entity on the prowl, ready to turn my night of fun into a spectacle of drama and despair. The HOA has always been a bit of a nuisance. For those who don't know, HOA is that thing that some neighborhoods have, where half a dozen people think they have the right to tell you what you can and can't do in your own home. I wasn't part of the HOA. My name was never on the contracts. I never paid fees, and, technically, they had no authority over me. But, of course, that never stopped this woman from trying. She had picked on me before. One day, she approached me to complain about the shade of blue on my door. "It's not within the HOA-approved palette," she said. I replied a resounding, "I don't care," and went on with my life. Then came the complaint about the height of the grass in my garden. It's growing too tall and devaluing the surrounding houses. I mean, if a house loses value because the neighbor's grass is a centimeter higher than it would like, then it's not my problem, it's the house that has low self-esteem. And now, here I was, in the middle of a private event, on my own property, gathering friends for a barbecue. And, of course, she couldn't miss it. The smell of meat on the grill and the sound of music must have been like a satanic invitation to that woman. I hadn't even noticed when she showed up, because, let's be honest, I wasn't worried about her opinion. But when I looked at the gate, there stood the shadow of chaos, with her arms crossed and an expression of pure contempt. She came in uninvited, which, if you ask me, was the first mistake. Who in their right mind breaks into someone's party to complain? That's against HOA rules. The urge to laugh was so strong that I almost choked on my beer. Now, tell me, what do you mean, against HOA rules? I'm not part of the HOA. I didn't sign anything. I don't pay anything to them. And my house exists outside the jurisdiction of this nonsense. But that doesn't matter to someone who firmly believes she rules over the entire neighborhood. She pointed at the guests and the barbecue, as if she were uncovering a terrible crime. Noisy events are not allowed. I looked around. Noisy? There were about 15 people, music at a moderate volume, and no confusion. The only thing that was out of the ordinary was the look of indignation on her face. That's when she unleashed the sentence that really made my brain freeze. "If you don't stop this mess, the HOA will start eviction proceedings against you." Yes, she said that. She threatened to kick me out of my own house. And it was at that moment that I realized I was dealing with someone who didn't know what she was getting into. Because, you see, there's one little detail she didn't know about me. I own the whole neighborhood. Have you ever seen someone dig their own grave with such conviction that it's embarrassing? Well, that's exactly what happened at that moment. The woman stood there, inflated with arrogance, ready to throw me out of my own house, as if I were a mere tenant of a system she herself had created. But the problem with those who think they're too powerful is that sometimes they forget to check the real size of their opponent, and she had no idea what was coming. After releasing the absurd sentence about the eviction, she crossed her arms, with the look of someone who thinks they've won. I stood there, absorbing the stupidity of the moment, trying to understand if she really believed what she had just said. But before I could even open my mouth, she continued talking. You're not within the HOA's rules. If I want, I can go to the board and we can start a process to remove you from the neighborhood. Oh, that's interesting. Remove me from the neighborhood that I happen to own? The problem with people who think they have the right to control everything around them is that they assume that everyone is beneath them. And that's precisely what made her sink. She continued. The HOA keeps this place organized. We can't let residents do what they want without respecting community guidelines. Respect community guidelines. In a neighborhood that I myself designed, financed, and still rent out to residents. I swear that, for a second, I considered revealing the truth right then and there, just to see the shock on her face. But that would have been too easy, so I decided to give it a go and see how far she would go. Right. Do you want to dump me because I'm having a party? She nodded vigorously, thinking she was finally bringing order to the chaos. Exactly. If you don't behave like a proper member of the community, then you'll have to leave. I think at that moment she expected me to panic, that I would bow down, apologize, and end the party. Maybe even sign some kind of deed, acknowledging her supreme sovereignty over the entire neighborhood. But what did I do? I smiled. A slight smile. The kind that makes people uncomfortable, because they don't know if they've just won or lost badly. Right. You want to start a process to get me out of here, don't you? She gave me a smile full of superiority, nodding her head in the affirmative. That's right. That's when I asked the killer question. And who exactly owns the house I live in? She blinked a few times, a little confused. What do you mean? You're the owner, right? I tilted my head to the side, as if considering the question. Yes, I am. And do you know who owns the plot next door? She frowned, trying to understand what I was getting at. The neighbor? What about the houses across the street? Now I could see the insecurity growing in her. What are you trying to say? I let out a theatrical sigh, as if I was really tired of playing. I'm saying that, before trying to evict someone, it might be interesting to see who really owns the neighborhood. That's when I finally checked out, because, in this case, I am. The impact of the phrase was immediate. She froze. She literally froze in place, as if her brain was desperately trying to recalculate its route after realizing that it had gone straight into a dead end. That's a lie? Oh, of course it is. After all, what could be more inconceivable for a woman like her than to discover that the person she tried to evict is the very man who owns the street where she lives? The level of embarrassment was palpable. So, just to make sure she understood once and for all, I decided to make everything very clear. I own this house, the houses around it, the streets, the vacant lots, and, technically, the HOA headquarters itself. She widened her eyes. That can't be true. I shrugged. Yes, it can. If you want, I can get the documents now and rub them in your face. The woman opened and closed her mouth a few times, trying to process what had just happened. But the final blow was yet to come. I lowered my voice a little, just to make the situation look even more dramatic. Do you know what that means? She winked. It means that if anyone is going to be evicted here, it's not me. And it was at that moment that I saw, with my own eyes, the absolute collapse of her arrogance. It finally sunk in. She realized that not only did she have no authority over me, but that she had just picked a fight with the only person in the neighborhood who could really send her away. She went white. Her hands were shaking. And for the first time in the history of that condominium, she had absolutely nothing to say. And that's when it got really funny. If I could capture one moment in this woman's life and turn it into a historic photo, it would be exactly that moment when she realized how big a mistake she had made. The arrogance she carried around like a trophy began to melt away instantly. The smile of superiority, gone as if it had never existed. The confidence of someone who thought they had control over everything, steam. Now fear began to creep in. Because, you see, in the game she liked to play, the game of power, empty threats, and made-up rules, she had finally found an opponent who could play much better. And I was in no hurry to end the game. The silence was almost melodic. She looked around, as if expecting someone from the HOA to come running out to defend her. But no one came, because, after all, there was nothing they could do. She was alone in this. Then, of course, came the stage of despair. "This can't be right," she muttered, her voice a little shaky. "You can't own all this." "Yes, I can. I am. Now, you see, she wasn't stupid. Manipulative? Yes. Authoritarian? Absolutely. But dumb? So, deep down, she knew I was telling the truth. But admitting she was wrong? That would be too much for her pride. And that's when the pathetic attempt to reverse the situation came in. She forced a nervous smile, the classic smile of someone trying to pretend that nothing had happened. "Well, in that case, I think it was just a little misunderstanding." "A slight misunderstanding? The woman literally tried to evict me from my own house, and now it was just a misunderstanding?" "Ah, I see," I replied, crossing my arms. "So, when you thought you were in charge, it was a non-negotiable rule. But now that you've discovered you're talking to the owner of the neighborhood, it's become a misunderstanding?" Her skin turned purple with nervousness. She opened her mouth to retort, but realized there was nothing to say. Because no matter how much she tried to rephrase the story, the reality was the same. She had messed with the wrong person and was now trapped in her own labyrinth of arrogance. She was silent for a few seconds, probably trying to redo the mental calculations on how to get out of this situation with some dignity left. Then came approach number 2, the emotional appeal. "Look, I was just trying to keep the neighborhood organized," she said, forcing a melancholy voice. "The HOA only wants what's best for the community." "The best for the community," she said. "And the best she wanted was to get rid of me because I was having a barbecue." "Really? The best for the community?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "And tell me, who exactly in the community asked you to come here and kick me out?" She opened and closed her mouth, but couldn't answer, because of course, nobody did. This was all a personal crusade of hers, a sick desire for control over anything that didn't fit into her little box of perfection. So I decided to deal the final blow. "Well, since I own the whole neighborhood, that means the HOA is using a space that belongs to me, right?" The woman went white, because it was only at that moment that she realized the size of the problem. If I owned the neighborhood, that meant I also owned the HOA headquarters. And you know what that meant? That, technically, they were occupying a building that was mine. "I could collect rent from you," I said, pretending to think. "But maybe it's simpler to kick the whole HOA out and put an end to this circus of useless rules." And that's when the panic hit. Her breathing quickened, her gaze filled with pure dread. You can't break up the HOA?" "Yes, I can. And in fact, I think that's exactly what I'm going to do." She shivered, because, for the first time, she wasn't in control of anything. "Minus I need to talk to the board," she stammered, taking a step back. "Good. Take the opportunity to tell them that the deadline for vacating the headquarters is running out." The woman shot out of there as if her life depended on it. And, as I watched her run around desperately trying to save the empire of control she thought she ran, all I could think was, maybe now she'll learn that playing queen has its consequences. But, of course, I hadn't seen her latest trick yet. Because when someone loses all their power, sometimes they do really stupid things to try and get it back. And this woman wasn't going to accept defeat that easily. Deep down, I knew that woman wasn't going to accept defeat that easily. People like her don't just throw in the towel and move on. They need one last desperate attempt, something to try and prove that they still have power. And that's exactly what she did. 2 days after our little confrontation, I receive a letter from the HOA. I opened it, expecting yet another nonsense, but this time it was worse than I imagined. It wasn't a fine or an infringement notice. It was a document announcing that the HOA was taking legal action against me for misconduct against the community and behavior detrimental to the well-being of the neighborhood. The woman was really trying to sue me out of existence. If I wasn't already sure that she had completely lost her grip on reality, this would have been the definitive proof. I almost felt sorry, almost, because it was obvious what was happening. After discovering that I was the real owner of the entire neighborhood, after realizing that she couldn't threaten or intimidate me, her last card was to try to use the judicial system as a weapon. She was betting that I'd be scared of the paperwork, that I'd panic at the idea of a lawsuit, and perhaps even offer some kind of settlement so that she'd take it easy. But what she didn't know was that I already had a lawyer on the phone before I'd even finished laughing at her stupidity. 5 minutes later, confirmation came. The paperwork was worthless. It wasn't even a formal lawsuit. It was just a ridiculous attempt at intimidation. A child's prank trying to scare an adult. If it was a game she wanted, then a game she was going to get. The next morning, I sent my own legal notice to the HOA. First, an order demanding that they vacate the HOA headquarters within 30 days, since, as had been made clear, the building belonged to me. Then, a formal lawsuit against the HOA for harassment and extortion attempts, detailing all the times they tried to levy illegal fines against me or interfere with my right to use my own property. And finally, the most beautiful thing of all, a notice of dissolution from the HOA, making that organization officially extinct within the neighborhood. If that woman freaked out when she realized that I owned the neighborhood, imagine her reaction when she received the notice that her precious HOA would simply cease to exist. The panic was immediate. She tried to rally the other HOA members to unite against me, but no one wanted to get involved. Now that they knew I was the real owner of the neighborhood, no one wanted to pick a fight with me anymore. That group of neighbors who had previously blindly followed her orders began to drift away. Fear struck, because if I wanted to, I could send everyone away. The only person who didn't accept reality was her. The woman tried to call an emergency meeting to reverse the decision, but the HOA headquarters was already officially closed. I simply turned off the power to the building, since the bills were paid by me. I put an official notice on the door stating that the organization no longer existed and that any attempt to continue operating in the name of the HOA would be considered fraud. When she got there, furious and ready to kick up a fuss, she ran into a group of former HOA members who had already accepted the inevitable and were clearing out their things. It was the first time she realized that not only did she no longer have any power over me, but that she had also lost any control over the entire neighborhood. And then came the final blow. The HOA members themselves threw her out as president, not because they wanted to please me, but because they realized that she had bought too big a fight and put them all in the line of fire. They still tried to reason with me, asked if there was any way to save the association, but I made it very clear that the decision had already been made. The HOA was dead, and there was nothing they could do to change that. After years of reigning as the dictator of the neighborhood, it was finally alone. The HOA no longer existed. The neighbors who once supported her now wanted to distance themselves from her. And, without a title to cling to, she was completely directionless. It was then that she made her final decision. She put the house up for sale. She couldn't stand being there anymore. She couldn't stand the idea of living in a place where she couldn't boss anyone around. But look, who do you think had priority to buy any house in the neighborhood? Exactly, Mr. And that's how I bought her house. Not because I needed it, not because I wanted to live there, but because I wanted her to know that the only reason she once had power in that neighborhood was because I let her. She sold the house and disappeared. I never heard from her again. The neighborhood finally had peace, without absurd rules, without made-up fines, without an HOA breathing down everyone's neck. And all this happened because someone decided it was a good idea to threaten me with eviction in the neighborhood I own. Let that be a lesson. And if you agree with what happened, don't forget to comment and leave a like to support the channel even more.